The night Daniel Mercer walked into the mountains to end his life, the storm arrived without warning, rolling across the ridgeline like a living thing determined to erase every trace of human presence. Snow slashed sideways through the darkness, carried by violent wind that howled through dead pine trees and rattled the rusted frame of an abandoned fire lookout tower overlooking miles of black wilderness. The world below was invisible, swallowed by fog, shadow, and falling snow, and Daniel stood alone at the edge of the overlook with his boots planted inches from a drop that promised silence deeper than sleep. Once, he had been Sergeant Daniel Mercer, U.S. Army Ranger, decorated K-9 handler, a man trusted to move first into danger while others followed, but war had taken pieces of him no doctor could repair. The explosions ended years ago, yet they still lived behind his eyes, waking him at night, shaking his hands, stealing every moment of peace until living itself felt heavier than dying. His breath trembled as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn leather collar cracked by time and weather, the metal tag faintly clinking against his glove, and even before he looked down he knew the name engraved there, Rex, the German shepherd who had been more than a military asset, more than a trained animal, but a partner who understood commands without words, fear without confession, loyalty without condition. Daniel's throat tightened as memories surged back. Desert heat, patrol routes through narrow villages, Rex walking slightly ahead scanning for danger, ears alert, tail steady, always watching, always protecting, and then the mission that never left him, the sudden halt, Rex freezing mid-step, the warning bark, Daniel shouting for his team to stop, and the explosion that followed seconds later, throwing dust and fire into the sky while Rex absorbed the blast meant for him. Daniel survived with scars and medals. Rex never came home. Since that day Daniel carried a question that hollowed him out from the inside. Why him and not the dog who had done everything right? The wind pushed harder against his back as if urging him forward, and for the first time in months his thoughts slowed enough to make the final step feel simple, almost peaceful, because exhaustion had replaced fear and surrender felt like relief. He leaned slightly toward the abyss, eyes closing, ready to let the mountain take him, until a bark cut through the storm like a gunshot. Daniel's eyes snapped open and he turned, convinced grief had finally broken his mind, but through swirling snow a shape emerged, moving steadily against the wind, powerful shoulders pushing forward, ears upright, eyes bright even in darkness, a German shepherd. The dog stopped several feet away, snow clinging to its thick fur, breathing calm despite the chaos around them, and stared directly into Daniel's face with an intensity so familiar it hurt to breathe. For a long moment neither moved, the storm raging everywhere except in the invisible space between them. Daniel felt his heartbeat accelerate as recognition fought disbelief. Rex! The name slipped out before logic could stop it, but the dog simply tilted its head, studying him, then sat perfectly still in disciplined posture, the exact way a trained military K-9 awaited instruction. Daniel staggered back a step, shaken not by fear but by memory, because no ordinary stray carried that level of training or awareness. The shepherd watched him carefully, then let out a soft whine, not desperate but understanding, as if sensing something broken inside him. Slowly the dog stood, turned toward the forest, and barked once, sharp, commanding, before glancing back at him, repeating the motion again and again, clearly urging him to follow. Daniel hesitated, the cliff still behind him calling for surrender, yet years of instinct awakened without permission. Handlers learned early that when a trained shepherd insisted on movement, it meant something mattered. Against his own expectations, Daniel stepped away from the edge, and the dog immediately relaxed, tails swaying once before leading into the dense woods where branches groaned under heavy snow and darkness swallowed all sense of direction. They moved through narrow animal trails, the shepherd adjusting pace whenever Daniel lagged, occasionally glancing back to ensure he followed, demonstrating discipline that spoke of advanced training rather than coincidence. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours until a faint sound broke through the storm. A human voice, weak and desperate, barely audible beneath the wind. Daniel froze, every survival instinct snapping awake, and the dog bolted ahead, barking urgently until they reached a small clearing where a pickup truck had slid off an icy mountain road and crashed against a tree, its headlights flickering weakly while snow piled rapidly around it. Inside, a middle-aged man struggled to stay conscious, one leg trapped beneath twisted metal, blood dark against frozen fabric, breath shallow and fading fast. Without thinking, Daniel rushed forward, checking airway, pulse, injuries, his military training returning as naturally as breathing while the shepherd stood beside them alert and protective, scanning the forest as if guarding the rescue operation itself. The truth hit Daniel with overwhelming force. The dog had found the accident and come searching for help, and if Daniel had taken that final step minutes earlier, this stranger would have died alone in the storm. As he wrapped his jacket around the injured man and searched desperately for phone signal only to find none, the reality settled heavily in his chest. The mountain had interrupted his death with someone else's survival. Snow thickened, wind intensified, night closed in, and Daniel realized they were trapped miles from assistance with temperatures dropping fast enough to kill all three of them if help didn't arrive soon. He looked back at the shepherd, meeting those steady amber eyes filled with intelligence and quiet trust, and something long buried inside him stirred: purpose, responsibility, the faint return of a man who once believed saving lives mattered. Some people say a dog never forgets the human connected to its mission, and in that freezing silence Daniel felt as if this shepherd had found him for a reason he did not yet understand. Far down the mountain road, almost hidden by snowfall, a pair of distant headlights appeared briefly, paused as though observing the scene from afar, and then suddenly went dark, leaving Daniel with the unsettling feeling that the storm had not only brought a dog into his life at the exact moment he planned to leave it, but had also awakened a mystery that was only just beginning. The storm tightened its grip on the mountain as Daniel Mercer forced himself into motion, the freezing wind clawing at his face while survival instincts long buried beneath grief began to awaken with sharp clarity. The injured man inside the wrecked pickup shivered uncontrollably, his breath shallow and uneven, shock settling deeper with every passing minute, and Daniel understood with absolute certainty that waiting for rescue was no longer an option because the storm would claim them long before help arrived. Snow piled rapidly against the truck doors while the German shepherd moved with disciplined urgency around the clearing, scanning the darkness beyond the trees, nose lifted into the wind as if reading invisible signals carried through the storm. Daniel checked the man's pulse again, weak but steady, then secured a pressure wrap around the crushed leg using supplies scavenged from the vehicle, his hands working automatically as years of military medical training returned without hesitation. In that moment, he was no longer a broken veteran standing on the edge of surrender but a ranger in the field responsible for another life. The injured man opened his eyes briefly, pain and fear clouding them. "You came back for me," he whispered, as if surprised rescue had actually arrived. Daniel paused, struck by the weight of those words, because only minutes earlier he had intended to disappear forever. Yet now he found himself fighting to keep a stranger alive. "You're going to make it," Daniel said firmly, though the storm outside argued otherwise. Behind him, the shepherd suddenly stiffened, releasing a low warning growl that cut through the wind, and Daniel turned instinctively toward the forest. Nothing visible moved among the snow-covered trees, yet the dog's posture told him something important. They were not alone on this mountain. The shepherd trotted back carrying a heavy leather glove clenched gently between its teeth, placing it at Daniel's feet. Daniel frowned, recognizing immediately that it belonged to neither him nor the injured driver. The glove was dried beneath the snow, recently dropped, proof that another person had been nearby not long ago. His thoughts returned to the headlights he had seen earlier on the mountain road, a vehicle that had paused, watched, and then vanished without offering help, and an uneasy feeling settled in his chest, the same instinct that once warned him of ambushes overseas. The shepherd nudged his leg impatiently, as if urging action, and Daniel nodded, decision forming quickly. They needed shelter, warmth, elevation, and possibly communication equipment. The abandoned lookout tower uphill offered the only chance. He explained quickly to the injured man that moving would hurt but staying meant certain death, then braced himself and pulled carefully against twisted metal until the trapped leg came free. The man screamed before collapsing against Daniel's shoulder, nearly losing consciousness, but Daniel stabilized the limb with makeshift splints and wrapped him tightly in blankets before lifting him onto his back. The climb uphill felt endless as wind hammered against them and snow erased the trail with every step, yet the shepherd led confidently, moving ahead and circling back whenever Daniel slowed, guiding him through terrain Daniel could barely see. Several times Daniel slipped, knees crashing into ice, but each time the dog returned instantly, pressing against him as if refusing to let him fall. Muscle memory resurfaced. Commands spoken softly, pacing adjusted instinctively, silent trust rebuilt between human and dog, and Daniel realized he was operating exactly as he once had with Rex, moving not as a lone survivor but as part of a team again. When the lookout tower finally appeared through the storm, relief nearly broke him. He forced open the door and carried the injured man inside, laying him near the wall while broken windows allowed icy air to creep in but offered protection from the worst of the wind. Daniel scavenged old debris and ignited a fire inside a rusted barrel, flames flickering weakly before growing strong enough to push warmth into the frozen room. For the first time since stepping away from the cliff, Daniel allowed himself to breathe. The shepherd approached quietly and lay beside him, shoulders touching, calm yet alert, and Daniel studied the dog carefully under firelight. Strong build, focused eyes, scars consistent with field deployment, and a worn harness bearing faint lettering nearly erased by time, K9 unit. The realization stirred something deep within him. This dog had belonged to someone, trained for purpose, not abandoned by accident. Slowly, Daniel reached out and placed his hand on the shepherd's neck, expecting hesitation, but the dog leaned gently into the touch, accepting him without fear, and emotion tightened Daniel's chest as memories of Rex flooded back. Patrols at dawn, silent companionship, loyalty stronger than words. Outside, the storm roared like distant artillery, but inside the tower an uneasy quiet settled until the shepherd suddenly lifted its head, ears forward, growl building low and steady. Daniel followed its gaze toward the broken window overlooking the road below. Through the swirling snow, faint headlights appeared again, stationary and facing directly toward the tower as though someone watched them from the darkness. Seconds stretched painfully long. The lights remained still, observing, waiting. Then, without warning, they shut off, plunging the mountainside into complete darkness once more. Daniel's heartbeat quickened as cold realization spread through him. Whoever was out there knew exactly where they were, had seen the rescue, and had chosen not to come closer. The shepherd remained rigid beside him, eyes locked on the black horizon, and Daniel felt the unmistakable sensation that the night held more than a storm, more than coincidence, and that stepping away from death had pulled him into something far more dangerous than he could yet understand. The fire crackled softly inside the abandoned lookout tower, its weak orange glow pushing back only a fraction of the cold pressing in from every broken window and cracked wall, and Daniel Mercer sat motionless beside the German shepherd while unease settled heavily in his chest. Outside, the storm continued to rage, wind screaming across the mountain like distant artillery fire, but Daniel's attention remained fixed on the darkness where the mysterious headlights had vanished moments earlier. Years in combat had taught him one lesson above all others. Coincidence rarely existed when danger lingered nearby. Someone had driven up that mountain, stopped long enough to observe, then deliberately turned off their lights. That was not fear. That was intention. The injured man stirred weakly behind him, pulling Daniel back to immediate reality. Daniel crawled closer, checking breathing and pulse again. Still alive, but fading. Hypothermia threatened despite the fire, and Daniel added more broken wood into the barrel, flames rising higher. The man's eyelids fluttered open. Did you see anyone?" he asked hoarsely. Daniel hesitated before answering. "Maybe," he said quietly. "But right now we focus on keeping you alive." The man swallowed painfully. "Name's Victor Hale," he whispered. "Daniel," he replied automatically, though speaking his own name felt strange after months of isolation. Victor nodded faintly before drifting back into exhausted silence. The shepherd remained alert, positioned between the doorway and the two men, eyes constantly scanning, ears twitching at every distant sound. Daniel watched the dog carefully. The posture was unmistakable: guard mode. Protective assignment. The animal had shifted roles without command, assuming responsibility for security as naturally as breathing. Daniel leaned back against the cold wall, exhaustion finally catching up with him. His muscles trembled from carrying Victor uphill, but deeper fatigue lived inside his mind, the emotional weight of realizing how close he had come to ending everything. Only minutes separated the man who stood at the cliff and the man now keeping another human alive beside a fire. He looked at the shepherd again. "Who are you?" he murmured softly. The dog turned toward him at the sound of his voice, tail moving once against the wooden floor. Firelight reflected in intelligent amber eyes that held neither fear nor hesitation, only recognition. Daniel felt a strange sensation settle over him, not ownership, not command, but partnership. Slowly, he reached toward the harness again, brushing away snow and dirt until more letters became visible beneath worn fabric. K9 unit, followed by partial numbers too faded to read. Military, or federal. Definitely trained. A sudden realization struck him. If this shepherd belonged to an active handler, then somewhere out there another person might be searching desperately for their partner. But why was the dog alone? And why had it found him specifically, at the exact moment he planned to die? The question lingered heavily. Outside, a distant sound broke through the wind. An engine. Low. Slow. Moving uphill. The shepherd reacted instantly, rising to its feet, body tense, a deep growl vibrating from its chest. Daniel extinguished part of the fire's flame using a metal lid, reducing light inside the tower. Instinct guided him. Visibility worked both ways. Anyone outside could see them clearly if the fire burned too brightly. Headlights appeared again through blowing snow, climbing closer this time. Daniel's pulse quickened. The vehicle stopped several hundred feet below the tower. Engine still running. Lights on. Waiting. No rescue sirens. No shouted voices. Just silence. The shepherd moved closer to Daniel, muscles rigid, gaze locked on the approaching threat. "Easy," Daniel whispered, though his own nerves tightened. He scanned the room quickly, identifying potential defensive positions. Old instincts returned fully now: angles, exits, lines of sight. The abandoned tower suddenly felt less like shelter and more like a vulnerable observation post. The engine shut off. Darkness swallowed the road again. A car door opened somewhere below. Then another. Footsteps crunched through deep snow. More than one person. Daniel's breathing slowed deliberately as training took control. Whoever approached had ignored an obvious rescue situation earlier, and returned only after darkness deepened. That alone told him enough. These were not random travelers offering help. The shepherd's growl deepened. Victor stirred weakly behind him. "What's happening?" "Stay quiet," Daniel said calmly. The footsteps stopped outside the tower. Silence pressed heavily against the walls. Then came a knock, slow, deliberate, almost polite. Daniel didn't move. A voice called from outside, muffled by wind. "We saw lights up here. You folks need assistance?" The words sounded friendly, but something about the tone felt wrong, controlled, rehearsed, lacking urgency despite obvious danger. Daniel remained silent, studying the shepherd's reaction. The dog did not relax. Instead, its hackles rose higher, lips curling slightly to reveal teeth. Dogs read intentions humans often missed. Daniel trusted that instinct. The voice spoke again, slightly firmer. "Weather's getting worse. We can help you down the mountain." Still, Daniel said nothing. Seconds stretched. The wind howled louder. Finally, footsteps shifted, moving slowly around the tower rather than leaving. They were checking exits. Daniel's stomach tightened. These men were not rescuers. They were hunters trying to confirm who was inside. The shepherd stepped forward, positioning itself directly between Daniel and the door, ready to defend without hesitation. Watching the dog stirred something powerful inside Daniel. A memory of Rex standing exactly the same way before missions, silent assurance that he would never face danger alone. Daniel's hand rested gently against the dog's neck. "I know," he whispered. Outside, another voice muttered something low and irritated, words carried briefly by the wind before disappearing. A beam of flashlight swept across one of the broken windows, briefly illuminating the room before moving on. They were searching. And they knew someone was here. Daniel realized with chilling clarity that the injured man, Victor Hale, might not be a random accident victim at all. Whoever waited outside had returned for a reason, and that reason was likely lying injured behind him. The knock came again, louder this time. "Last chance?" the first voice called. "Open up!" The shepherd barked sharply, a warning filled with authority. Daniel remained still, heart steady, mind calculating. He had walked into these mountains ready to die. Now he found himself preparing to fight again. And as the storm raged around the tower and unknown men circled in the darkness, Daniel Mercer understood something with sudden, undeniable certainty. The dog had not only saved him from death, it had led him straight into a mission he never expected to survive. "You're on the free plan." The silence inside the lookout tower grew heavier after the second knock faded into the storm, and Daniel Mercer felt the familiar shift inside himself, the transformation from broken veteran to active protector, as every sense sharpened with quiet precision. Outside, boots crunched slowly through deep snow as the unknown men circled the structure, flashlights sweeping across shattered windows. searching not with concern but calculation, and Daniel knew without doubt that they were confirming identities rather than offering rescue. The German shepherd stood rigid at the doorway, muscles coiled, eyes fixed on every movement beyond the walls, a low growl vibrating constantly in its chest, and Daniel trusted that reaction more than any spoken threat because trained dogs recognized danger long before humans could explain it. Behind him, Victor Hale stirred weakly, confusion clouding his face as he whispered, "They found me, didn't they?" The words struck Daniel instantly. This was no random crash. Daniel crouched beside him, voice low but firm. "Who are they?" Victor hesitated, fear flashing across his features before pain forced honesty. I used to work security for a private logistics company. We transported things we weren't supposed to ask about. Tonight I took proof, files, drives, evidence they were moving weapons through civilian routes. I ran before they realized." Daniel's jaw tightened as realization settled into place. The men outside were not rescuers but recovery personnel sent to eliminate a problem, and Victor was that problem. The shepherd suddenly shifted, ears snapping toward the rear window, signaling movement on the opposite side of the tower. They were spreading out, attempting to block escape routes, and Daniel felt adrenaline steady his breathing instead of accelerating it, years of combat discipline returning with terrifying clarity. He quietly dimmed the fire further, plunging most of the tower into shadow while snow blew through broken boards, carrying icy air and the scent of pine and danger. A flashlight beam suddenly pierced the darkness through a cracked window, lingering longer this time as if someone inside suspected movement. Daniel remained perfectly still, one hand resting on the shepherd's shoulder, feeling the dog's controlled tension mirroring his own. Outside, a voice muttered impatiently, followed by the metallic click of something heavy, not tools, not rescue equipment, but weapons being readied. The storm masked many sounds, yet Daniel recognized the rhythm instantly. These men expected resistance. Victor grabbed Daniel's sleeve weakly. "They'll kill anyone with me," he whispered. Daniel looked down at him, conflicted only for a moment before clarity settled in. Minutes earlier he had stood ready to surrender his life, but now another man's survival depended entirely on him, and somehow that responsibility felt like oxygen filling lungs that had forgotten how to breathe. The shepherd glanced back at Daniel, eyes locked onto his, awaiting direction, and Daniel nodded almost imperceptibly, the silent language of handler and K9 reawakening without formal command. "We're leaving," Daniel whispered. The dog moved instantly toward the rear exit, confirming the path was clear before returning, demonstrating training too advanced to be coincidence. Daniel quickly gathered supplies, rope, blankets, Victor's jacket, then lifted Victor onto his back again despite burning exhaustion, knowing staying meant confrontation against armed opponents in a fragile structure. As he moved toward the rear opening, footsteps suddenly pounded toward the front door and a flashlight beam flooded the entrance. Someone tried the handle, finding it locked from within. "He's in there," a voice snapped outside. The shepherd barked once, loud and commanding, then sprinted toward the opposite wall, deliberately drawing attention away from Daniel's escape route, an action so strategic Daniel felt a surge of disbelief. The dog wasn't reacting randomly. It was assisting a tactical withdrawal. Daniel slipped through the rear exit into violent wind and snow, nearly losing balance as cold air slammed into him. But the shepherd rejoined him seconds later, appearing from darkness like a shadow returning to its partner. Together they descended the steep backside of the mountain, moving away from the road while voices shouted behind them, realization spreading among the pursuers that their targets were escaping. Flashlights cut through the storm, beams swinging wildly as men spread into the forest. Daniel pushed forward despite pain tearing through his legs, trusting the shepherd's guidance as it navigated hidden trails invisible beneath snow. Branches whipped against his face, ice cracked beneath his boots, and several times he nearly collapsed under Victor's weight, yet each stumble was met with the shepherd circling back, nudging him forward with unwavering determination. Gunshots suddenly echoed through the trees, sharp, violent cracks swallowed quickly by wind, sending snow cascading from branches above. They were not warning shots. They intended to stop them permanently. Daniel dove behind a fallen log, shielding Victor while scanning for movement, heart steady despite danger because purpose had replaced despair. The shepherd crouched beside him, eyes blazing with focused intelligence, ready to defend or advance depending on command. In that frozen darkness, Daniel understood something profound. He had come to the mountain believing his life had already ended, yet now every instinct fought fiercely to survive, not just for himself but for the injured stranger and the loyal dog beside him. He whispered softly, "Stay close," and the shepherd pressed against him as if answering, its presence grounding him more than any weapon ever could. Daniel hurried forward, boots slipping, heart pounding, until suddenly a loud crack split the night. The ice beneath him fractured violently, spreading spiderweb fractures outward, and Daniel realized with chilling clarity that escape had just become far more dangerous than the men chasing them. The storm reached a terrifying climax just before sunrise, turning the ocean into a roaring battlefield where darkness, wind, and water moved together like a single unstoppable enemy. And Lieutenant Hayes stood at the front of the rescue craft gripping the rail as waves exploded over the deck, soaking the Navy SEAL team in freezing salt water while lightning ripped open the sky again and again, illuminating fragments of floating wreckage that drifted like ghosts across the violent sea. Exhaustion weighed heavily on every man after hours of relentless searching, their muscles trembling from cold and fatigue, radios filled with static. Fuel dangerously low, yet Hayes could not shake the feeling that someone was still alive, somewhere within the chaos, waiting for help that might never come if they turned back now. And just as doubt threatened to settle over the crew, Rex, the fearless German shepherd whose instincts had already saved multiple lives, rose suddenly from his position, ears locked forward, body tense, barking sharply into the storm toward a distant shadow barely visible between towering waves. Trusting Rex without hesitation, Hayes ordered the pilot forward, and as they approached the shape grew clearer. A broken section of the ferry barely afloat, metal torn open like a wound, slowly being swallowed by the sea, and inside that collapsing structure they saw movement. A father pinned beneath twisted beams, arms shaking as he desperately held his unconscious daughter above the freezing waterline. His strength nearly gone after fighting the storm alone for hours, the SEALs reacted instantly, diving into the icy ocean despite the deadly conditions, knives cutting through cables while waves slammed them against jagged steel, each impact threatening broken bones, yet they refused to retreat, working together with disciplined precision as Hayes reached the trapped man and reassured him through the chaos while another operator attempted to lift the crushing beam that refused to move. Time slipped away as the wreck groaned louder, warning of imminent collapse, until Rex jumped into the flooded compartment without command, swimming through debris and oil-dark water to reach the girl, pressing his warm body against her chest and barking softly, repeatedly, as if refusing to let her drift into unconscious silence. And that small act of loyalty ignited renewed determination among the rescuers who forced the hydraulic spreader into place, pushing against metal that screamed under pressure until finally the beam shifted, freeing the father just moments before the entire structure began breaking apart. A deafening crack echoed through the storm as the ferry section collapsed behind them, sending a massive surge of water crashing into the rescue boat, and nearly flipping it sideways, equipment sliding across the deck while one seal lost footing and disappeared beneath the waves, creating a split second of pure terror until Rex lunged forward, gripping the man's vest and holding on despite being dragged across the water himself, allowing the team to pull both of them back aboard in an act of courage that stunned everyone watching. Above the chaos, the rescue helicopter finally broke through the storm clouds, its spotlight cutting through rain like a promise of survival as the winch cable descended violently in screaming wind, and extraction began amid shouting, rushing water, and pounding rotor blades. The injured father secured first, barely conscious yet alive, followed by the small girl wrapped in thermal blankets as medics fought desperately to restore warmth to her fragile body, her faint breathing becoming the most precious sound anyone had heard all night. One by one the exhausted SEAL operators clipped into the harness and rose into the air, their strength nearly spent after battling nature itself, until only Hayes and Rex remained on the sinking deck surrounded by debris slowly disappearing beneath the sea, and for a brief moment Hayes knelt beside the shepherd, placing a hand on Rex's soaked fur, silently acknowledging the bond forged through danger before attaching the final harness and lifting together into the roaring sky. Inside the helicopter the transition from chaos to quiet felt unreal. Thunder fading behind them as dawn's golden light spread across calming waters, revealing the storm's retreat as if nature itself had finally surrendered, and when the rescued girl slowly opened her eyes and reached weakly toward Rex, touching his face with trembling fingers, hardened warriors who had faced combat without fear felt emotion rise unexpectedly in their chests because that simple moment proved the mission had mattered. Hours later, back on shore, emergency crews rushed survivors toward waiting ambulances while news helicopters circled overhead capturing images that would soon travel across the world. Yet Hayes paid little attention to recognition or praise, instead watching Rex rest beside him, exhausted but alert, tail moving slightly whenever one of the rescued survivors passed by to whisper thanks. And as sunlight fully replaced the storm, Hayes understood that heroism is rarely loud or celebrated in the moment. It exists in decisions made when failure seems certain, in teamwork that refuses to break, and in the unwavering loyalty of a shepherd who followed instinct into darkness and helped bring strangers back from the edge of death. Long after official reports reduced the mission to numbers and timelines, those who survived would remember something far greater: the freezing water, the thunder, the fear, the hands that refused to let go, and the night when courage stood stronger than the storm itself, proving that even against nature's most merciless fury, hope survives when brave hearts choose to fight for one another until the very last second. The ocean looked peaceful the next morning, almost innocent, as if the storm had never existed. But Lieutenant Daniel Hayes knew better because storms never truly ended for men like him. They only moved from the outside world into the quiet spaces inside the mind, and as the rescue base settled back into routine, helicopters refueled, equipment dried, and official commendations began circulating through command channels, Hayes found himself sitting alone on the edge of the pier watching Rex lie beside him, the German shepherds breathing slow and steady while gulls cried overhead and sunlight shimmered across calm water that hid the violence of the previous night. News crews called the mission heroic, command officers praised flawless execution, and fellow operators celebrated survival with loud laughter in the mess hall. Yet Hayes felt detached from all of it because victory often carried a strange weight, one only veterans understood: the knowledge that every successful rescue was shadowed by memories of missions where not everyone came home. Rex sensed it immediately, lifting his head and resting his muzzle against Hayes's knee, a quiet reminder that some companions did not need words to understand pain. And Hayes absent-mindedly scratched behind the dog's ears while his thoughts drifted back years earlier to deserts filled with dust storms, night raids under silent helicopters, and brothers in arms whose names still echoed in his memory long after the world had moved on. He remembered the first day Rex entered his life as a young military working dog candidate, untrained, alert, watching everything with intelligent caution, and how trainers warned that the shepherd possessed unusual independence. A trait that made some handlers nervous but made Hayes feel understood, because both man and dog carried a stubborn refusal to break. Together they learned trust under gunfire and chaos, Rex detecting explosives hidden beneath roads that looked harmless, Rex standing guard during endless nights when sleep never fully came, Rex pulling Hayes to safety during an ambush that should have ended differently. And somewhere along those years the relationship stopped being handler and asset and became something deeper. Two survivors navigating danger side by side. After the ferry rescue, medical evaluations cleared Rex for continued service, and the team joked that the dog deserved higher rank than half the unit, but Hayes noticed small things others missed. The way Rex flinched slightly at sudden metallic crashes, the long stares toward empty corridors, the exhaustion hidden beneath loyalty. And Hayes recognized those signs because he felt them too. Invisible scars carried by warriors who never spoke openly about fear or loss. Weeks passed as operations continued, yet sleep grew harder for Hayes, nightmares returning with relentless clarity, drowning passengers reaching through dark water, explosions from distant deployments blending with thunder, and voices calling for help just beyond reach, waking him before dawn with cold sweat and racing heartbeat, while Rex would rise instantly each time, pressing close until breathing slowed again, guarding not against enemies but against memories themselves. Command eventually called Hayes into a quiet office overlooking the harbor where a senior officer spoke carefully about accumulated deployments, psychological strain, and the recommendation many operators eventually faced: retirement from active service, not as punishment but as recognition that even the strongest warriors deserved rest, and though Hayes listened respectfully, the words felt heavier than any mission briefing because the military had been his identity, his purpose, his shield against the emptiness waiting beyond uniform and duty. Leaving meant silence, uncertainty, and confronting emotions long buried beneath discipline, yet when Hayes stepped outside afterward, Rex walked beside him without hesitation, tail low but steady, as if already accepting whatever future awaited them together. The retirement ceremony arrived weeks later under clear skies, flags moving gently in ocean wind while fellow SEALs stood in formation, expressions proud yet somber, knowing that saying goodbye to an operator meant closing a chapter written in sacrifice and brotherhood. And when Hayes removed his trident for the final time, placing it carefully into a presentation box, he felt an unexpected ache, not relief, not regret, but a profound sense of being untethered from the only life he had ever known. Rex sat perfectly still during the ceremony, eyes fixed on Hayes as applause echoed across the base, unaware of ranks or honors yet fully aware that something irreversible had changed. And as they walked away together carrying a duffel bag filled with memories rather than gear, Hayes realized that outside the military there would be no mission orders, no structured danger, no clear purpose waiting at dawn. Civilian life greeted them with uncomfortable quiet, a small coastal town far from operations where Hayes rented a modest cabin surrounded by pine trees and endless silence, hoping distance from war would bring peace. But silence often amplifies what noise once concealed, and nights became the hardest battleground as memories resurfaced without warning, loneliness creeping in despite Rex's constant presence. Neighbors saw only a reserved veteran walking his German shepherd along fog-covered trails, unaware that each step was part of an invisible fight against guilt and grief. While Rex adapted quickly to the new environment, patrolling the property instinctively, alert to every sound in the forest, remaining close whenever Hayes withdrew into thought. Some people believe retirement marks the end of a soldier's struggle, but for Hayes it felt like standing on unfamiliar terrain without a map, uncertain who he was without missions to complete or lives to save. And yet Rex refused to let isolation fully claim him, nudging him outside during long mornings, guiding him toward routine, reminding him through simple loyalty that purpose could still exist beyond uniform. One evening, as fog rolled thick through the trees and distant thunder murmured along the coast, Hayes noticed Rex suddenly stiffen near the forest line, ears forward, gaze locked into darkness with an intensity Hayes had not seen since active operations, and something deep in his instincts stirred, a familiar warning that danger did not always announce itself with sirens or gunfire, because sometimes the next mission finds a soldier long after he believes his fighting days are over, and as Rex stepped slowly toward the shadows, refusing to look away, Hayes felt the unsettling realization that the storm they survived at sea might have only been the beginning of a far more personal battle waiting just beyond the trees. The cabin felt smaller the moment Hayes heard the sound outside. The storm intensified, reducing visibility to almost nothing, and Daniel seized the opportunity, moving deeper into the forest where terrain grew steeper and more dangerous, hoping the weather itself would become their ally. Behind them, voices faded but did not disappear, proof the hunters were still tracking. Snow fell thicker, swallowing footprints slowly, yet Daniel knew trained pursuers would not give up easily. Minutes stretched into exhausting eternity until the forest opened onto a narrow frozen ravine, its icy surface glimmering faintly beneath storm clouds. A risky crossing, but possibly their only chance to break pursuit. Daniel hesitated, calculating danger, when the shepherd stepped forward confidently onto the ice, testing weight carefully before looking back at him with unwavering certainty, silently urging trust. Daniel followed, carrying Victor across the frozen surface while wind roared around them, every step threatening disaster, and halfway across a distant shout echoed behind as flashlights appeared at the ridge they had just left. They had been spotted again. The walls, once a refuge from the noise of the world, suddenly felt thin and exposed, as if the darkness itself had leaned closer to listen. Years of military conditioning returned instantly. His breathing slowed, steady and controlled. His mind sharpened. Every sound separated into layers, wind brushing through pine branches, loose metal tapping somewhere near the dock, waves breaking far below the cliffs, and beneath it all, movement that didn't belong. Rex stood near the door, completely still, muscles tight beneath his thick coat. His ears pointed forward, tail rigid, a deep warning growl vibrating from his chest. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. The kind of alert Rex had only shown in combat zones where danger hid behind patience. Someone wasn't just nearby. Someone was watching. Hayes moved quietly from the bed without turning on the lights. Darkness worked in his favor. His bare feet crossed the wooden floor soundlessly while his hand reached beneath a shelf to the small locked safe he rarely opened. The pistol inside rested untouched for months, yet the moment he held it again, old reflexes returned like muscle memory carved into bone. He paused beside the window, lifting the curtain slightly. Fog swallowed most of the property, rolling in from the ocean like slow-moving smoke. The porch light flickered weakly, barely pushing through the mist. At first glance, nothing moved. But Rex's growl deepened. Hayes trusted the dog more than his own eyes. A faint shadow shifted near the treeling. Gone in an instant. too controlled to be an animal. Human. Hayes opened the door slowly. Cold night air rushed inside, carrying the smell of salt water and damp earth. Rex stepped out first without command, lowering his body slightly as he scanned left and right, every movement precise and professional, a working dog even after retirement. The yard appeared empty. Yet Hayes felt it, that invisible pressure veterans recognize instantly. The feeling of being measured, studied. He moved toward the gravel path, eyes tracking details automatically. Broken grass. A faint scuff near the fence. Then he saw them. Boot prints. Fresh. Deep impressions pressed into damp gravel. Not hiking boots. Not local fishermen. Military-grade tread. Recent enough that moisture still pooled inside the pattern. Someone trained had approached his home. Rex advanced to the edge of the trees and froze. His posture shifted from defense to focus. Nose lifted. Breath slow. Tracking. Then Rex barked once, sharp, commanding, unmistakable. From deep within the forest came the sound of retreating footsteps. Fast but controlled. Whoever had been there knew how to move quietly, yet Rex had forced them to abandon stealth. Hayes instinctively stepped forward to pursue, adrenaline surging through him, but Rex turned and blocked his path again, positioning himself directly in front of Hayes. The same silent refusal from the shoreline earlier. Not safe. Not yet. Hayes exhaled slowly, tension tightening across his shoulders. Whoever it was had come prepared. Observed long enough to know routines. Left before confrontation. This wasn't curiosity. This was surveillance. He returned to the cabin, locking the door, checking windows, extinguishing unnecessary lights. Rex refused to settle, pacing once before positioning himself near the entrance like a sentry who understood the stakes better than any alarm system ever could. Sleep never came. Hayes sat at the table through the night, staring into darkness while memories collided with instinct. Retirement had been supposed to mean distance from violence. Distance from missions. Distance from decisions that cost lives. Instead, the past had found him again. Dawn finally broke through thinning fog, pale sunlight stretching across the trees. The world looked peaceful, birds returning, waves calmer, air still. Too still. Hayes stepped outside cautiously, coffee warming his hands as he scanned the property again. That's when he saw it. An envelope resting on the porch railing. Plain white. No stamp. No markings. Someone had walked close enough to place it there without waking him, or alerting Rex. That realization unsettled him more than anything else. Rex sniffed the envelope carefully, tail low but steady. No explosive scent. No chemicals. Just paper, and human presence. Hayes opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph. The moment he saw it, the air seemed to leave his lungs. The image showed him years earlier during deployment overseas, full combat gear, dust-covered face, rifle slung across his chest. Rex stood beside him, younger but equally alert, eyes bright under desert sun. But someone had circled another figure in red ink. A man partially hidden behind a military vehicle. Marcus Vane. The name struck like a physical blow. Former intelligence contractor. Officially declared killed during a classified operation 8 years ago. The same operation where Evan Cole died. Hayes remembered the reports. Intelligence failure. Miscommunication. Enemy ambush. Tragic but unavoidable. He had accepted responsibility. Carried it. Punished himself for years. But Marcus Vane being alive meant something else entirely. It meant the mission might never have been a mistake. At the bottom of the photograph, handwritten words cut through him. "You were never supposed to survive." Hayes felt cold despite the morning sun. Rex pressed closer, sensing the shift in his handler's breathing. The shepherd let out a quiet whine, nudging Hayes's hand as if grounding him back into the present. For years Hayes believed guilt belonged to him. What if it didn't? What if Evan's death had been planned? The thought unsettled everything he believed about loyalty, command, and sacrifice. Hayes scanned the treeline again, heart beating harder now. Whoever delivered the photograph knew exactly which wound to reopen. This wasn't random intimidation. This was an invitation. Or a warning. Maybe both. Some people spend their lives running from war only to realize war remembers them perfectly. Hayes folded the photograph carefully and slipped it into his pocket. The quiet life he built along this coast suddenly felt temporary, fragile, a pause before something darker arrived. Rex walked beside him as he stepped off the porch, the shepherd's body brushing his leg in silent reassurance. Maybe loyalty is not something humans teach dogs. Maybe it is something dogs remind humans of when trust between people collapses. Hayes stared toward the ocean. He had almost walked into those waters days earlier, ready to disappear. Now he understood something else. Someone had expected him to disappear long ago. And they were surprised he hadn't. Inside the cabin, Hayes opened an old metal case he hadn't touched since leaving active duty. Inside lay carefully stored memories, service patches, worn gloves, encrypted radios, a map folded along familiar lines. Rex watched quietly, tail moving slowly as if recognizing the return of purpose. The man who tried to bury the past was gone. In his place stood a soldier searching for truth. Because if Marcus Vane was alive, and Hayes knew, deep down, the next one would not be quiet. The moment Hayes reopened the metal case from his military years, the atmosphere inside the cabin changed so completely that even the silence felt heavier, as if the past itself had stepped across the threshold and refused to leave again. And while pale morning light pushed through the fogged windows, Rex remained seated beside him with unwavering focus, watching every motion like a seasoned partner recognizing the beginning of a mission rather than the continuation of ordinary life. Hayes laid out old equipment slowly, weathered maps marked with faded coordinates, encrypted radios once trusted in combat zones, worn gloves still carrying the memory of desert dust, and finally placed the photograph of Marcus Vane at the center of the table, staring at the circled face that had haunted his thoughts since dawn. Because Vane had not merely been an intelligence contractor but the man responsible for mission timing, surveillance data, and extraction authorization during the operation that ended Evan Cole's life. And if Vane had survived while an elite team walked into a perfectly orchestrated ambush, then the guilt Hayes carried for years might have been carefully planted rather than earned, a realization that ignited anger beneath layers of grief he had buried deep enough to nearly destroy himself. Rex shifted closer and pressed his head gently against Hayes's arm, sensing the rising storm inside him, grounding him the way only a loyal dog can when words fail and memory becomes too heavy to carry alone. And outside the cabin the rolling fog transformed the coastline into a living maze of concealment where every tree line became potential cover, and every shadow a possible observer. Forcing Hayes's military instincts fully awake as he stepped onto the porch with binoculars scanning terrain automatically. Elevation. Advantages, approach routes, blind spots along the gravel road. Because once a soldier realizes he has been watched, safety becomes an illusion. Rex moved ahead with controlled precision, nose low to the earth, pausing near the tree-line where disturbed soil revealed fresh tracks partially hidden beneath fallen pine needles, evidence that someone had returned during the early hours. Someone disciplined enough to erase most traces yet unable to escape Rex's heightened senses, and Hayes followed. Slowly, noticing faint impressions of tactical boots and the lingering smell of engine exhaust carried faintly on coastal wind, confirming surveillance had not ended but intensified. Back inside, Hayes powered up the encrypted laptop he had sworn never to use again, fingers moving instinctively across keys as he accessed fragmented veteran networks, archived intelligence forums, and data caches. Forgotten by official systems, searching for confirmation until a discovery froze him. The official record of Marcus Vane's death had been altered multiple times after classification review, quietly reassigned from killed in action to operational status redacted, before disappearing entirely, meaning someone with authority had erased him from public history while allowing rumors of death to stand, and such protections suggested ongoing operations powerful enough to rewrite military records themselves. Before Hayes could process the implications, Rex rose sharply, a low growl vibrating through the cabin as a black SUV appeared on the distant dirt road below, slowing deliberately near the property line as if verifying surveillance before continuing past, its tinted windows hiding occupants yet leaving behind undeniable proof that Hayes was no longer alone in this investigation. And the calculated timing of the vehicle's appearance told him something worse. They knew he had reopened old files. Hayes watched through binoculars until the SUV vanished into fog, heart steady yet mind racing, and for a brief moment exhaustion whispered that he could still walk away, close the case, return to solitude, pretend none of this mattered. But Rex turned and locked eyes with him, the same unwavering look that had stopped him from walking into the ocean days earlier, reminding Hayes that survival sometimes means choosing purpose over escape. Determination replaced hesitation as Hayes packed supplies carefully: field medical kits, survival rations, spare ammunition, portable surveillance equipment, transforming grief into preparation while memories of Evan resurfaced vividly, shared jokes during long deployments, promises of peace after service. Trust between soldiers who believed command would never sacrifice them, and Hayes felt the weight of unfinished loyalty settle into something stronger than anger. Because if Evan had died due to betrayal rather than war, then silence would mean abandoning him a second time. By afternoon Hayes drove into Port Alder, Rex seated upright beside him like a sentinel, drawing respectful glances from locals who recognized the shepherd from the ferry rescue broadcast across national news, yet Hayes noticed details others ignored. Two unfamiliar men positioned outside a closed bait shop, posture disciplined, eyes scanning movement. With professional awareness, hands never far from concealed jackets, tracking Hayes subtly while pretending casual conversation, confirming the surveillance network extended beyond his isolated cabin. Inside a harbor cafe, elderly dockmaster Walter slid a folded newspaper toward Hayes without speaking. An article circled around a newly acquired shipping company purchasing abandoned coastal warehouses. Through shell corporations tied to offshore defense contracts once connected to intelligence operations involving Marcus Vane, and realization struck instantly. The same network that engineered the fatal mission overseas might now be operating along this quiet coastline under commercial cover. Leaving the cafe, Hayes followed Rex's sudden bark toward the harbor where a massive cargo vessel sat anchored farther offshore than regulations allowed, engines idling though cargo operations appeared inactive, crew movement synchronized with military precision rather than civilian routine, triggering instincts Hayes could never suppress because everything about the ship suggested controlled secrecy rather than trade. And as sunset spread crimson light across the ocean, Hayes understood that the photograph left on his porch had not been intended as intimidation but as a calculated move to draw him into the open, testing whether the broken veteran would investigate or retreat into silence. Standing beside Rex as wind rose off the water and gulls circled overhead, Hayes felt clarity return stronger than fear, realizing that someone believed him too damaged to fight back, too burdened by guilt to question official history, yet the bond beside him, the shepherd who refused to abandon him at his lowest, reminded him that loyalty demands courage even when truth threatens everything, and he whispered quietly into the wind, "We finished this," while Rex stared toward the distant cargo ship with focused intensity, sensing danger long before humans fully recognize it. Because sometimes a dog understands destiny sooner than the man he protects, and as darkness slowly reclaimed the coastline, Hayes knew the next step would lead directly into confrontation with enemies who had hidden behind lies for years. Enemies now aware that the soldier they expected to disappear had instead chosen to stand, uncover the truth, and walk willingly toward whatever waited beyond the rising night. Night settled over Port Alder with a heavy stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the town itself sensed that something hidden beneath its quiet streets was beginning to move, and Hayes sat in his truck overlooking the harbor while distant lights reflected across dark water, Rex positioned beside him with alert calm, watching the cargo vessel anchored offshore with unwavering focus, because every instinct Hayes possessed told him that ship was connected to Marcus Vane and the unanswered questions surrounding Evan's death. The engine remained off, windows slightly cracked to let cold ocean air drift inside, carrying the smell of salt, diesel fuel, and approaching rain, while Hayes studied the vessel through binoculars, noting details civilians would overlook: the absence of visible company markings, restricted deck lighting, crew movements too synchronized to be ordinary dockworkers, and a rotating watch pattern resembling security protocol rather than commercial activity, confirming that whatever operation existed here was organized, disciplined, and prepared for interference. Rex suddenly stiffened, ears forward, gaze locking onto movement near the far pier where an unmarked van rolled slowly toward a restricted loading area, its headlights dimmed intentionally, and Hayes felt the familiar tightening in his chest that preceded action, the same awareness that had once kept him alive in hostile territory, because patterns were emerging and the timing was too precise to be coincidence. He stepped out quietly, keeping to shadows between storage containers while Rex moved at his side without command, paws silent against damp pavement, both of them blending into darkness shaped by years of training together. And from behind stacked crates Hayes observed men unloading sealed metal cases from the van onto a small transfer boat heading toward the cargo ship, their posture unmistakably military despite civilian clothing, controlled movements, minimal conversation, constant scanning of surroundings, behavior learned only through operational experience. Hayes snapped several photos with his phone, heart steady yet mind racing, recognizing equipment markings partially concealed beneath tarps that resembled advanced surveillance hardware rather than commercial goods, suggesting smuggling not of weapons but of information technology or intelligence systems. And the realization deepened his suspicion that Evan's fatal mission might have intersected with a covert program still active today. Suddenly Rex let out a low warning growl, pulling Hayes backward just as a security guard rounded the corner earlier than expected, flashlight beams slicing through darkness, inches from where they had been standing, forcing Hayes to retreat silently behind containers while rain began falling harder, masking their movement but raising tension as footsteps approached dangerously close. The guard paused, scanning the area longer than expected, and for several breathless seconds Hayes considered the possibility of capture, knowing exposure now would end any chance of uncovering the truth. But Rex remained perfectly still beside him, body pressed low, disciplined beyond instinct, demonstrating the extraordinary control born from years of military partnership, until finally the guard turned away and radioed something unintelligible before leaving, allowing Hayes and Rex to slip back toward the truck unseen. Once inside, Hayes exhaled slowly, adrenaline fading into cold clarity, realizing that whoever operated here maintained professional security layers designed to detect trained observers, meaning the threat surrounding him was far more dangerous than a single surviving contractor. And as thunder rolled across the coastline, he reviewed the photos again, freezing when one captured face emerged clearly under dock lighting. A man Hayes recognized from deployment briefings long ago, an operative connected to intelligence logistics working directly under Marcus Vane. Proof that Vane's network was alive and active. The rain intensified, drumming against the windshield while Rex watched the harbor without blinking, sensing tension building long before human understanding caught up, and Hayes felt the past closing around him, memories of betrayal and lost comrades merging with present danger until one realization became unavoidable. Evan had not died in random chaos, but likely discovered something he was never meant to see. Something powerful enough to eliminate witnesses and bury truth beneath classified silence. Hayes started the engine and drove slowly away from the harbor, choosing caution over confrontation, because charging forward without understanding the full scope would only repeat past mistakes. Yet as headlights cut through rain, he noticed the same black SUV pulling onto the road behind him, maintaining distance but never turning away, confirming surveillance had escalated into active tracking. Rex shifted closer, eyes fixed on the rear window, a protective rumble rising in his chest as Hayes adjusted speed, testing whether the vehicle would follow. And it did, matching every turn through winding coastal roads, creating a silent pursuit that stretched for miles until Hayes suddenly veered onto an abandoned logging path known only to locals, tires sliding over wet gravel while trees swallowed both vehicles into darkness. The SUV followed at first but hesitated deeper into the forest where narrow terrain eliminated easy maneuverability, eventually stopping while Hayes continued forward before circling back along an alternate route, using old tactical driving techniques to break visual contact. And when he finally emerged onto the main highway alone, relief mixed with certainty that whoever watched him no longer considered him harmless. By the time he returned to the cabin, rain had turned to heavy wind rattling windows and bending trees. Yet Rex refused to relax, pacing once before taking position near the door as if guarding against an unseen threat, and Hayes placed the photograph of Marcus Vane beside the newly captured harbor images, forming a growing pattern impossible to ignore. A hidden operation, trained personnel, erased records, and surveillance focused specifically on him. Exhaustion settled into his bones, but sleep felt dangerous now, because each step closer to truth increased risk not only to himself but to the loyal dog who refused to leave his side, and Hayes quietly wondered whether bringing Rex into this fight again was fair. Yet when he looked down and saw unwavering trust reflected in the shepherd's eyes, he understood that some bonds are not about safety but about standing together regardless of danger, because loyalty does not calculate odds, it simply chooses who to protect. Outside, storm winds howled across the cliffs while waves crashed violently below, mirroring the conflict rising inside Hayes as he realized the next move would force direct confrontation with Marcus Vane's network, and somewhere beyond the darkness, someone was likely preparing for that same confrontation, watching, waiting, deciding whether the retired soldier and his German shepherd needed to be stopped before the truth finally surfaced. The storm refused to loosen its grip even as dawn struggled to push faint light through the torn clouds, turning the ocean into a battlefield of roaring wind and collapsing waves where survival depended on seconds, instinct, and unbreakable trust, and Lieutenant Hayes stood at the helm of the rescue craft feeling the weight of every decision pressing against his chest like armor made of memory and regret. Hours of non-stop rescues had drained the Navy SEAL team beyond exhaustion, their muscles trembling from cold and effort, radios filled with static. Equipment failing one piece at a time, yet scattered distress signals still blinked faintly across damaged screens, reminding them that somewhere beyond the chaos people were still waiting for help that might never come if they turned back now. Command's order to withdraw echoed through Hayes' headset, firm and final, warning that conditions had crossed the edge of survivability. But Hayes lowered the radio slowly and looked toward Rex, the German shepherd standing steady at the bow despite waves crashing over the deck, rain streaming down his powerful frame while his ears locked towards something invisible in the distance. And in that silent exchange Hayes felt the same certainty he had trusted in combat zones years earlier. The dog sensed life still out there, hope still fighting against the storm. Without hesitation Hayes pushed the throttle forward for one final run. Engines roaring angrily as the rescue craft charged into towering swells that slammed against the hull with violent force, each impact threatening to flip them into the dark water below, lightning illuminating the ocean in terrifying flashes that revealed broken debris fields drifting like ghosts of disaster until suddenly a shattered lifeboat appeared wedged between floating wreckage, several survivors clinging weakly to metal already sinking beneath rising waves, their strength nearly gone, voices lost beneath the screaming wind. The SEAL team moved instantly, throwing lines, securing harnesses, diving into freezing water despite hypothermia risks, pulling survivors aboard while waves battered them again and again. And Rex leapt across unstable debris, barking fiercely to guide rescuers through blinding rain, refusing to retreat even when collapsing steel crashed beside him. His fearless presence anchoring panic-stricken survivors long enough for hands to reach them. Then disaster struck when a massive surge knocked one operator unconscious and dragged him beneath the surface, disappearing into black water as chaos erupted across the deck. But before anyone could react, Rex dove without command, cutting through waves and circling above the drowning man, barking sharply until Hayes dove after them, and together they hauled both man and dog back onto the boat, coughing, shaking, alive only because loyalty acted faster than fear. Relief barely settled before a monstrous rogue wave rose. Behind them, towering higher than anything they had faced that night, a moving wall of darkness swallowing the horizon while alarms screamed and the engine struggled against flooding seawater, and Hayes realized there was no escape, only endurance. So he ordered everyone to brace, shielding survivors as the wave crashed down with unimaginable force, flipping gear, tearing equipment loose, throwing men across the deck, nearly capsizing the vessel before it slammed back upright against all probability, leaving stunned silence broken only by desperate breathing and the realization that somehow, impossibly, everyone was still alive. Yet victory turned fragile as the engine died completely, leaving them drifting powerless while the storm continued its relentless assault, waves pushing them toward dangerous rocks hidden beneath foam and darkness. And Hayes transmitted a final distress signal through crackling static, unsure whether anyone could hear, while Rex moved calmly among survivors, pressing his head against trembling hands, resting beside the injured, offering silent reassurance stronger than any spoken promise. Minutes stretched endlessly, hope thinning with every passing second, until a distant rhythmic sound pierced through thunder, the unmistakable beat of helicopter rotors fighting the storm. And suddenly a rescue helicopter emerged from the clouds like a miracle refusing to surrender, its powerful spotlight slicing through rain, while the pilot risked everything to hover above raging seas, The rescue line dropped violently through whipping wind, and one by one survivors were lifted into the sky, each ascent a battle against spinning gusts that threatened to tear them away, followed by injured operators secured carefully despite shaking hands and failing strength. And when it was Rex's turn, the shepherd paused, scanning the deck as though ensuring no soul had been forgotten before stepping into the harness and rising into the storm-lit air, rain swirling around him like a guardian ascending from battle. Hayes remained last aboard the crippled craft, scanning the horizon one final time, refusing to leave until absolutely certain no voice still called for help, and only then did he secure himself to the line. Ascending slowly while waves crashed below, leaving behind the storm that had tested every limit of courage, grief, and endurance. As the helicopter climbed above the storm layer, everything changed. The violent noise faded, sunlight burst through golden clouds, and calm replaced chaos so suddenly it felt unreal. Exhausted SEALs collapsing into seats while survivors cried quietly, holding one another as shock gave way to overwhelming relief. And Rex curled beside a rescued child who buried small fingers into his wet fur, finding safety in the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing. Hayes watched the sunrise stretch across the horizon and understood something deeper than victory. The mission had not only saved lives but restored something inside him that war and loss had nearly destroyed, proving that redemption is not found in escaping pain but in choosing compassion again and again even when fear demands retreat. And as the coastline finally appeared below with emergency lights glowing like welcoming stars, the team realized that long after headlines faded and the storm became memory, the true legacy would remain in every heartbeat that continued because they refused to give up, and in the silent bond between a soldier and his German shepherd who showed that sometimes the bravest act is simply refusing to let another life be lost to darkness. The helicopter finally settled onto the runway beneath a sky washed pale by early morning light, and as the rotors slowed their violent spinning, the world seemed to exhale for the first time since the storm began, leaving behind an almost sacred silence broken only by distant sirens and exhausted footsteps. And Lieutenant Hayes stepped down carefully, boots touching solid ground while his body still moved as if balancing against invisible waves, muscles trembling from cold, fatigue, and adrenaline that refused to fade. Emergency crews rushed forward with blankets, medical kits, and urgent voices calling out names, confirming survivors, counting lives saved, yet Hayes heard everything as though from far away because his attention locked instantly onto Rex, the German shepherd emerging from the helicopter behind him, fur-soaked, eyes alert, moving through chaos with calm purpose until he reached Hayes' side and pressed gently against his leg, grounding him back into reality with a silent reassurance that words could never match. Survivors were escorted toward ambulances where warmth, oxygen masks, and careful hands replaced terror, and across the runway families who had waited through the night broke into tears as loved ones returned alive against impossible odds. Children running into open arms, spouses collapsing into embraces that carried relief, disbelief, and gratitude all at once. And Hayes watched quietly from a distance, feeling pride mixed with something heavier, a deep awareness of how close those reunions had come to never happening. Medics insisted he sit while checking his temperature and pulse, wrapping thick blankets around his shoulders. But Hayes barely noticed the cold because memories from the storm replayed endlessly behind his eyes. The moment he ignored withdrawal orders, the split-second decisions that balanced life against loss, the terrifying wave that nearly ended everything. And he understood again that leadership meant carrying choices no one else could fully understand. Rex refused to leave his side even when offered food and water by handlers, remaining watchful, occasionally scanning the crowd before returning his gaze to Hayes. as if ensuring the man who had trusted him through battle after battle was truly safe now, and watching the dog move among survivors, allowing trembling hands to rest against his fur, calming frightened children without command, made Hayes realize that loyalty sometimes heals wounds humans cannot even name. Reporters gathered near the gates hoping to capture heroism on camera, flashes cutting through morning haze. But Hayes turned away from them because recognition felt meaningless compared to the quiet miracle of survival unfolding around him, and instead he walked slowly toward the edge of the hangar where the noise softened. Rex matching every step, their shadows stretching long across wet concrete, still reflecting remnants of the storm. Inside the operations center later, commanders praised the mission as one of the most dangerous successful rescues in recent memory, reviewing footage of towering waves and impossible maneuvers, yet beneath official congratulations lingered subtle tension about rules bent and risks taken too far. And Hayes accepted both admiration and concern without protest because he knew storms never wait for perfect decisions. They demand courage first and explanation later. Hours passed in paperwork, debriefings, and medical evaluations, exhaustion settling deeper into his bones with every passing minute until the adrenaline finally began to fade, replaced by a heavy emptiness familiar to every soldier returning from intense combat. The silence after survival, when noise disappears and emotions finally catch up. When evening arrived, Hayes slipped away from the base buildings and walked toward the pier overlooking calm water glowing beneath a soft orange sunset, the same ocean now peaceful and almost innocent, hiding every trace of the violence it unleashed only hours earlier. And Rex followed without being called, paws tapping softly on wooden boards until they reached the end where wind moved gently across the water. Hayes sat down slowly, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the horizon while memories rose uninvited, faces of fallen teammates from past deployments, missions that ended differently, years spent convincing himself that emotional distance was necessary for survival. And for the first time in a long while he allowed those memories to exist without pushing them away, breathing deeply while Rex rested his head against Hayes' thigh, steady and warm, sensing the quiet battle still unfolding inside the man. Some people believe strength means never breaking, but veterans learn that true strength often arrives in moments of vulnerability, when silence forces truths to surface. And Hayes realized that the storm had stirred something deeper than adrenaline. It had reopened parts of his heart he believed permanently closed. Behind him the base slowly settled into night. Helicopters powered down, voices faded, and stars began appearing above dark water, yet peace refused to feel complete because instincts forged through. Years of combat whispered that unfinished stories rarely end so easily. Rex suddenly lifted his head, body stiffening, ears locked toward the distant ocean where darkness gathered beyond visible range, a low warning rumble forming in his chest despite the calm surroundings, and Hayes felt an old familiar tension tighten his shoulders, the unmistakable signal that danger sometimes arrives quietly rather than violently. He followed the dog's gaze across endless water and felt an unease he could not explain. No alarms, no distress calls, no visible threat. Only instinct, the same instinct that had saved lives during the storm. And in that quiet moment Hayes understood that survival does not always mean safety, because sometimes storms leave behind echoes waiting patiently beneath calm surfaces. The wind shifted slightly, carrying distant sounds from unseen waters, and Rex remained alert, unmoving, as though listening to something beyond human hearing, and Hayes placed a hand gently on the dog's neck, feeling steady warmth beneath damp fur while a strange certainty settled deep inside him. The mission that defined their courage might not be finished yet. Far beyond the horizon, something unseen was beginning to move, something connected to the disaster they had just survived, and as darkness fully claimed the sky, Hayes realized that some rescues do not end when people reach shore. Sometimes they lead directly into mysteries still waiting to be uncovered, and standing there beside Rex under quiet stars, he sensed that the next chapter would not test their strength against nature, but against truth itself. The night wrapped itself around the naval base like a heavy blanket of unfinished thoughts, and although the storm had passed hours earlier, Lieutenant Hayes felt no peace. Only a lingering tension pressing against his chest, as if the ocean itself had followed him back to shore, refusing to release its grip, and long after most of the rescue crews collapsed into exhausted sleep, he remained awake inside the dim operations center, replaying moments from the mission, while Rex lay nearby yet refused true rest, his ears twitching at every distant sound, sensing something beyond ordinary silence. Sometime past midnight, the stillness shattered when a piercing electronic tone erupted from the communications console, echoing through the nearly empty room as technicians jolted upright, scrambling toward blinking monitors while static flooded the speakers, and through layers of interference came a faint human voice, strained, terrified, repeating fragmented words that sounded less like a structured message and more like someone clinging to their last remaining strength. The signal fluctuated violently, nearly disappearing several times before stabilizing just long enough for coordinates to appear on screen, and confusion spread immediately because the transmission originated from a sector already swept thoroughly during the rescue operation, an area command officially classified as cleared with no remaining survivors or vessels. Hayes stepped closer, listening carefully, closing his eyes as years of operational instinct filtered noise from meaning. And beneath the distortion he recognized desperation, the unmistakable sound of someone who believed rescue might never arrive, while beside him Rex rose slowly, muscles tightening, releasing a deep, uneasy growl that caused every technician to fall silent, because military handlers understand that a trained shepherd reacts only when something real demands attention. Command officers debated rapidly over secure channels, suggesting equipment malfunction, drifting emergency beacons, or damaged transmitters activating automatically after exposure to seawater, but Hayes felt certainty settled deep inside him, the same certainty that had pushed him through combat zones and impossible decisions, and he spoke quietly yet firmly. Someone was still alive out there. Approval came reluctantly, accompanied by warnings about crew fatigue and rising fog conditions, yet within minutes a rapid response patrol craft roared awake under harsh floodlights while mist rolled across the harbor like ghostly breath rising from dark water, and Rex boarded without waiting for instruction, positioning himself at the bow with unwavering focus, nose lifted into wind currents invisible to human perception. As they departed the harbor, the ocean appeared calm, almost deceptively peaceful, its surface reflecting faint moonlight, while scattered debris drifted silently, life jackets, broken crates, twisted metal, remnants of the storm's violence now floating like unanswered questions, and Hayes studied navigation screens repeatedly, noticing irregular movement patterns within the signal's coordinates, shifts too deliberate to be random drift. Fog thickened the farther they traveled, swallowing stars and horizon alike until the world narrowed to the vessel's spotlight carving tunnels through darkness, radar flickering unpredictably as massive shapes briefly appeared beneath the surface before vanishing again, creating the unsettling impression that unseen giants moved quietly below. Then Rex barked sharply, pacing the deck with urgency, and through dense fog a colossal shadow materialized ahead, a cargo vessel far larger than any ship reported lost during the storm, half submerged yet stable, drifting with unnatural stillness, its exterior lights completely dead, antennas bent, communication arrays destroyed, and identification numbers violently scraped from the hull as though someone intended to erase its existence entirely. As they approached closer, the scale of damage became clearer. Sections burned rather than battered by waves, lifeboats missing though evacuation alarms had never been transmitted, cargo containers broken open with contents scattered across decks. And Hayes felt cold realization creeping into his thoughts that this ship had not simply suffered disaster, it had been abandoned intentionally, boarding cautiously. Weapons drawn, the team stepped onto metal slick with seawater, while loose chains swung overhead producing hollow echoes that carried across empty corridors, and inside they discovered unsettling signs of sudden departure, meals left unfinished, navigation charts scattered, emergency lockers forced open from the outside, suggesting panic mixed with calculated escape. Rex moved ahead confidently, tracking scent trails invisible to humans, guiding Hayes through narrow passageways until faint scratching sounds reached them from behind reinforced doors deep within the vessel's interior, weak yet persistent, and when the lock finally broke under force, flashlight beams revealed several civilians trapped behind metal barriers, exhausted humanitarian workers who had been imprisoned days earlier after armed smugglers seized control of the vessel to conceal illegal trafficking operations hidden among legitimate aid supplies. Survivors spoke through trembling breaths, explaining how their captors disabled communication systems and planned to abandon the ship during the storm, assuming nature would erase evidence and witnesses alike. But one crew member secretly restored partial power long enough to send the desperate signal before collapsing from dehydration. As medics prepared evacuation, relief mixed with anger spread among the rescue team, yet Rex suddenly stiffened again. Ears locked toward descending stairwells leading into lower cargo decks, a deep growl vibrating through his chest as faint footsteps echoed somewhere below, followed by the metallic slam of a closing hatch, proving beyond doubt that at least one person remained aboard. Tension surged instantly as Hayes signaled silent movement, flashlights slicing through thick darkness while the air grew colder and heavier with each step downward, dripping water echoing like distant ticking clocks counting toward confrontation. And the realization struck him fully: the storm had uncovered something far larger than a rescue mission, something dangerous enough for criminals to sacrifice innocent lives to protect. Deeper within the ship they discovered hidden compartments containing crates marked with falsified documentation, encrypted devices, and evidence suggesting a coordinated smuggling network operating under the cover of disaster relief operations. And Hayes understood they had unintentionally stepped into a criminal operation tied to powerful figures far beyond the ocean itself. Suddenly a distant engine roared somewhere within the vessel, followed by hurried movement and the unmistakable sound of someone attempting escape, and Rex lunged forward without command, barking fiercely as he led Hayes through twisting corridors toward the source, adrenaline surging despite exhaustion. Shadows moved at the far end of a cargo bay, a figure disappearing through emergency exits while alarms began flickering weakly back to life, and Hayes realized the distress call had never been only about rescue. It had been a final act of defiance from someone trapped inside a conspiracy desperate to remain hidden. Standing in the dim corridor with Rex poised beside him, heart pounding against rising danger, Hayes understood that the storm had merely opened the door to a deeper battle, one involving truth, betrayal, and enemies willing to erase entire ships to protect their secrets. And as footsteps echoed ahead into darkness, he knew the next moments would determine whether they had arrived in time to save the final witness. Then Evan Cole deserved justice. And someone out there had just declared the hunt open. Outside, wind moved through the trees again, carrying distant echoes from the sea. Rex lifted his head suddenly, ears sharp. Somewhere beyond the forest, an engine started briefly, then faded away. Whoever had come during the night wasn't finished. they had made the first move, or had walked directly into a trap waiting patiently since before the storm ever began. The storm was fading, but the ocean refused to forget what had happened beneath its surface, rolling slowly under a gray sky that felt unnaturally quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath, and Lieutenant Daniel Hayes stood at the edge of the rescue vessel watching broken pieces of lives drift across the water, shattered wood, torn flotation devices, fragments of metal reflecting pale sunlight. Silent reminders of how close death had come for everyone involved, yet despite the calm returning to the sea, an uneasiness settled deeper inside him with every passing minute. Storms end, missions conclude, survivors go home. But something about this operation felt unfinished, like a story interrupted before its truth could be spoken. Rex sat beside him, soaked fur drying in the cold wind, amber eyes scanning the horizon with unwavering concentration, and Hayes noticed the subtle tension running through the German shepherd's body, the same silent alertness Rex had shown years earlier during patrols overseas when hidden threats waited just beyond visible range. Dogs trained for war do not relax simply because humans believe danger has passed. And Rex's instincts had saved lives too many times to ignore now. Behind them, survivors rested under blankets while medics checked vital signs, the rescued little girl sleeping peacefully against her father's chest, unaware that minutes earlier the ocean had nearly claimed her forever. And watching them stirred something painful inside Hayes. Memories of faces he still saw in dreams, teammates he had promised to protect but never brought home. Missions labeled successful despite empty seats left behind afterward. A naval intelligence officer approached carrying a tablet filled with preliminary reports, explaining in careful language that meteorological analysts could not explain the storm's formation. It had intensified too quickly, moved too strategically, and maintained power directly over shipping routes connected to restricted maritime zones, patterns that suggested manipulation rather than coincidence. Hayes listened without speaking, feeling the quiet certainty grow stronger inside him that the storm had been more than nature's rage. Then Rex's ears snapped forward. A low growl escaped his throat as he stared toward distant debris drifting several hundred yards away, and Hayes followed his gaze, noticing a faint rhythmic flash beneath the water, a controlled signal, deliberate and precise, nothing like random wreckage reflecting sunlight. Orders were given instantly, and a small recovery boat cut through the waves toward the blinking light while wind whipped across the surface, carrying the smell of fuel and burned electronics. When the object was pulled aboard, the crew fell silent. It was part of a classified reconnaissance drone used exclusively by elite Navy SEAL intelligence teams, its casing cracked but internal components clearly damaged by tools rather than storm impact. Hayes felt his pulse quicken. That drone belonged to a surveillance unit officially declared missing 3 days before the storm began forming. Rex barked again, moving restlessly across the deck, leading the team toward another floating object, a tactical backpack tangled in netting, and when they retrieved it, salt water poured from torn fabric revealing encrypted communication gear smashed deliberately beyond repair. Someone had not only wanted equipment destroyed, they had wanted information erased. The implications settled heavily over the crew as more debris appeared aligned unnaturally across the ocean, forming a clear trail pointing toward the storm's original epicenter, and Hayes realized they were not looking at random destruction but at the aftermath of an operation interrupted mid-execution. Radio communications suddenly cut through the tension with sharp authority from higher command ordering immediate termination of recovery efforts, instructing Hayes' team to return to base without further investigation due to classified jurisdictional reassignment. Yet the tone carried no urgency for safety, only a demand for silence. Experienced soldiers recognize when orders protect lives and when they protect secrets, and Hayes felt that difference instantly. He looked down at Rex, who pressed quietly against his leg, sensing the shift in human emotion, and in that silent contact Hayes remembered something every handler learns over years of partnership. Dogs never question loyalty. They live it. Some people believe loyalty is obedience, but soldiers know it is responsibility, the refusal to abandon those who cannot defend themselves. And somewhere beyond the horizon were missing operators who had vanished trying to uncover something dangerous enough to bury beneath a manufactured storm. The sky slowly brightened as clouds broke apart, sunlight revealing an even larger debris field stretching into the distance, and among floating wreckage Hayes spotted something that tightened his chest, a torn American flag patch drifting alone on the water's surface, weathered yet unmistakable, belonging to one of the lost seals. He reached down and lifted it carefully, water dripping from the fabric, and in that moment the mission became personal. These were not anonymous casualties but brothers in arms whose story someone wanted forgotten. Around him the crew waited, uncertain whether to obey command or follow the evidence unfolding before them. And Hayes understood the weight of his next decision could define every life aboard the vessel. Turning away would mean safety, recognition, and obedience. Moving forward meant stepping into unknown danger against orders issued from far above his rank. Rex suddenly moved to the railing, barking sharply toward the distant horizon where dark clouds still lingered, as though urging him forward. And Hayes realized the dog was not reacting to fear but to purpose. The same unwavering drive that had once pulled him out of emotional darkness when he believed his own life had no value left. The ocean rolled quietly beneath them now, deceptively calm, hiding whatever truth waited ahead, and Hayes felt the familiar clarity that comes only in moments where hesitation disappears. Storms may end, but justice does not arrive on its own. He gave the order to adjust course toward the debris trail, ignoring repeated radio commands demanding compliance, because some rescues are not about saving bodies but about saving truth itself. And as the vessel turned slowly toward the unknown, sunlight breaking through clouds like a promise or a warning, Hayes understood they were no longer chasing survivors alone. They were moving toward the secret powerful enough to sacrifice soldiers, civilians, and an entire storm to remain hidden, and, deep within that growing silence, with Rex standing alert beside him, the mission transformed into something far greater than rescue. It became a fight against whatever force believed human lives were expendable beneath the cover of darkness and waves. The rescue vessel moved slowly through the heavy evening fog, its engines rumbling low beneath a sky painted in fading gray and cold blue light, and Lieutenant Daniel Hayes stood at the bow feeling the strange weight of anticipation pressing against his chest, because although the storm had weakened, the air carried a tension that refused to fade, as if the ocean itself was warning them they were approaching something never meant to be seen. Waves rolled gently now, almost deceptively calm, reflecting fractured pieces of moonlight, while scattered debris drifted behind them like ghosts of everything the storm had destroyed. Yet ahead the horizon remained unnaturally dark, a wall of shadow resisting the returning light of day. Rex stood beside Hayes, posture rigid, ears forward, muscles tight beneath his wet fur, watching the distance with the focused intensity only a trained military dog possesses when danger hides beyond human perception, and Hayes trusted that instinct completely because Rex had sensed ambushes long before gunfire ever began during their years overseas. Behind them, survivors rested quietly, exhaustion replacing fear. But the rescued SEAL lying in the medical bay had begun murmuring fragmented words in unconscious distress, references to containment zones, interference fields, and a ship that controlled the storm. phrases that unsettled the medical crew enough to report directly to Hayes moments earlier, deepening the suspicion that their mission had uncovered something far more dangerous than a maritime accident. Radar suddenly pinged again, sharper this time, revealing a massive stationary object directly ahead, far larger than any civilian vessel permitted in these waters, and as the fog thinned the silhouette slowly emerged, an enormous black ship rising from the ocean like a fortress, its hull towering high above the waterline, completely unmarked, navigation lights intentionally disabled. Its presence so silent and